Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Another one of our Safer at Home series. I had a momentary glitch there with my PowerPoint. All of a sudden, I couldn't stop the share. So trying to let people in. Like, what's going on here? Thank you for allowing me that moment of anxiety. Before we get started tonight, a couple of things. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5. First Citizen Federal Credit Union and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books that are on our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. We hope that you visit the locals and show some business. If you got a question, and I hope you have questions, because we want people reading this thing. Use the chat feature down below. And make sure you mute yourself so we can hear our speaker tonight. And when our speaker tonight, I have to say I was entranced with her ever since I read Cleopatra. Stacy Schiff is a Pulitzer Prize winner. She's written 5 books. She's kind enough to join us tonight to talk about something that we've all read since we've or known about since we were in grade school, about the Salem Witch Trials. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Stacy Schiff?
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Mark. So I'm taking my cues from you, I think.
Okay. Well, you put in your book that there's a line in your book that says that the population of New England in 1692 could have fit into Yankee Stadium, and yet so we know that it's not the largest population. There's 14 women, 5 men, 2 dogs. I feel really bad for the dogs. Get executed in this series. Why are the Salem Witch Trials so relevant, and why do they resonate with so many people even to this day?
It's a great place to start. I just want to start with the dogs, of course, because when I speak about the book and I say 14 people, 14 women, 5 men, and 2 dogs. It's only when you get to the dogs that you get this kind of collective, grief from the audience. So now we know what, how to affect people. I think it's a lot of reasons. I think witchcraft generally has staying power in all of our imaginations. I think it's something that by which we are all fascinated, whether we believe it exists or fails to exist. How a highly rational, in this case, highly literate people could have found themselves so deluded and taking what we consider today to be such a left turn into injustice continues to fascinate. It's pretty much hardwired into our DNA. I mean, the Salem Witch Trials is that sort of, stop between the early years, and if you don't stop anywhere else between the early years and the Civil War, you stop in Salem for 1692. I think it tallies on some level with our sense of these benighted people from whom we descend. And I think Hawthorne and Arthur Miller have a great deal to do with it. I think we all come up against the Salem Witch Trials when we are adolescents. It's very much a story about adolescence on every level, on the colonial level, on the level of the girls who are originally afflicted by witchcraft. The whole story is really about coming to terms with autonomy. And I think we come to terms with it at an age when we are coming into our own. And it just kind of gets into the drinking water at that point. I think most of us either read or starred in The Crucible in high school. I didn't, which is perhaps my excuse for having spent 5 years writing a book about it.
You mentioned about the Puritans, and you said something like they were the most educated people of that time, in history up to that period of time. But you got a line in there. The Puritans were a crazy quilt of erudition and superstition. And then talk about basically that medicine almost equaled witchcraft, that religion equaled superstition. Talk about the Puritans and the people that basically make up this book.
Well, one of the reasons that you can have such a full-scale embrace of a single concept like this is that you have a very homogeneous population. So obviously the population of Massachusetts in the 17th century is almost entirely composed of Puritans, or at least of people who are attending Puritan worship. They have all read the same books and heard the same kinds of sermons. and much of which begins to surface when you look closely at the Salem testimony, in fact. But because of that, because of the fact that you are talking about, deep-seated faith and a very book-oriented population, you have an immensely literate population. It's probably the most literate population in the world until that time, for better or worse. So, so you have, first of all, a full-scale embrace of books, and you also have an immensely erudite ministry. And much of what will happen in 1692, much of what will be heard in the courtroom, and much of the advice which will be given to the court is given to it by a couple of ministers who've essentially read every book in creation until this moment. I mean, many people, I think, have said if Cotton Mather had a smaller library, there may have been fewer difficulties that year. These are people who've really made the rounds of the literature. And in fact, the only literature that's really, well, there are two pieces of literature that are not available in the colony at that point. There isn't a copy of Shakespeare yet. There won't be for many years. There are no copies of books that are skeptical of witchcraft. And so what you have at this point is a moment in time where most of Europe has has released itself from the spell of witchcraft, is no longer prosecuting witches. And New England is still stubbornly stuck in the past. And that is partly because the ministry has stood as a sort of firewall between it and what we would consider more enlightened literature.
Is Salem and the surrounding towns, are they kind of at a crossroads between coming out of the medieval period and entering the Enlightenment? Is that a fair juxtaposition of time, or is...
I'm not sure you can say that. I think you can say that after Salem, after the witch trials, the church will, of necessity, release its hold a little bit. The church will have been undermined by what it allowed to happen, or what it didn't prevent in any case in 1692. So there is a certain, there's a certain worldliness, or at least open mind, a certain amount of fresh air that will creep into New England after the trials. Obviously, there has been a tremendous amount of back and forthing about tolerance and about freedom of worship. And the trials will certainly put this whole concept of a monolithic religion on trial itself.
Friend Mary Fran, you want to unmute yourself on this one? Because it's got a question about religion. So I'll defer to our friend Mary Fran Buckley. So well, she's got a question here. I don't know if you can see it in the chat, but it says, religion was central to everyone's life among the Puritans. From the book, quote, as ever, the theory paradox of Puritanism loomed. The Orthodox childhood may have been particularly steeped in fear. It's difficult to say if pious homes bore higher strung children. Any comments on that? Or
my research assistant when I was working on this book was the daughter of a minister, and she was so hugely helpful. The witchcraft breaks out, the two first afflicted children, the two first afflicted little girls, are daughters of the Salem village minister. And obviously whatever they had, whatever was afflicting them, which we presume today was not witchcraft, was something that may have had something to do with the fact that they lived in a particularly devout home. Their father could be extremely draconian. He was under fire from the community. He was very much at odds with the community, and a very unforgiving man who, at this moment, it's January, or February, it's the end of a very, very cold winter. He's been arguing with his parishioners about deliveries of firewood. So this whole idea that the house could go cold at any moment, the feeling of being under an onslaught of disgruntled congregants must have been very real to the girls. I mean, there would have been people tramping in and out of the house to discuss and presumably argue with their father. But they're also brought up with, if you read the text today, you see a tremendous dose of a very large helping of fear. which was central to the Puritan childhood. And, not to overly generalize, but the idea that essentially you're born in sin and you maybe make your way toward grace, or maybe you don't, would have led you to question yourself at every moment. And what you see sort of trickling out during the trials is an enormous amount of self-doubt and of what we would today call guilt or a bad conscience. Of various things that people feel they've done. I mean, a pregnant woman who trips over a chair and thinks that this is entirely her fault, accuses herself, can't forgive herself. People who think they're in communion with the devil because they have done something that they consider unforgivable, or someone whose child has fallen ill, who blames herself. And all of that is part and parcel of this enormous helping of guilt am calling guilt, this enormous helping of damnation that one is carrying around with one, having read the text that these girls would have been reading in their early years.
Okay. My pal Lauren's got a question here. Most Puritans, as stated in the book, quoted religion when it comes to normal day life or any issues that arose in the village. Were the trials a way of the girls to scapegoat their deep-seated religious community to have their own say and earn respect of the religious male-dominated world?
Well, that's a lovely theory, isn't it? We can't speak to the girls, which has been a real problem, obviously, in figuring out what they're trying to say. Is there a bit of revenge on one's elders here? Let's go back to one of the first girls, one of the first accusers is actually not from Salem. She's from Topsfield, and she's 14 years old. Her name is Abigail Hobbs, and she very quickly throws not one but both of her parents under the bus and accuses them both of witchcraft. She's the local bad girl. It's actually her stepmother. She's often accused her stepmother of being a heathen. She's spent all night out in the woods. She's been, quite a terror. She's driven her parents to distraction. Is there an element here of an adolescent girl acting out against her elders? From today's perspective, it certainly would sound so. And religion was a particularly effective way of getting there. As to motives, a lot of this is clearly concerted by adults in the community. People are clearly being fed cues by adults in the community. There's no way, many of these girls are accusing people they've never met before. So there's clearly some sense here that someone is choreographing this, and it isn't necessarily the afflicted girls.
There's obviously a huge cast of characters here. And I think we can also agree that what was going on in Salem is a combination of probably ignorance and self-interest. You just mentioned about the 14-year-old going after her stepmom, that's a, but there's also, I think to you, there's some clear villains led by William Stoughton. Talk about him.
And it's a great question, Mark. I should go back for a second and say, there's one other piece of this, which is that for many people that year, there would have been a feeling of the fact that one was doing one's religious duty by accusing someone of witchcraft, that one was helping to purify the community, that one was helping in this attempt that one was doing what one should have done as a devout member of the community. And so this idea that was largely propagated by Cotton Mather, the minister, that the devil will touch down where he's hated the most, and that this was a badge of honor in a funny way, that Salem and the Salem area was being infested by this plague of witches, is really important in the sense that I do think many people are motivated by what they seem to think, by what they truly seem to believe. I don't think a lot of people are necessarily settling scores and extracting grudges from and operating on grudges against their neighbors all of the time. Stoughton is interesting because he's essentially the Chief Justice. He's the Chief Justice of the court, and he's the one person who really could have shut things down or questioned them, or at least changed the procedures early on had he wanted to. And he has reasons of his own to pursue the trials. He's been a member of most of the previous Massachusetts administrations. He's gone back and forth politically from one side to the other. He had been out of favor just before 1692 and then essentially saved by Cotton and Increase Mather, the two ministers at the center of the trials. And it is at this sort of politically fraught moment, which we can talk about for a minute, it is his need and desire to prove Massachusetts to have a law and order government. So it is in his best interest essentially to prosecute as effectively and as vigorously as possible. And I guess that's the thing that also I should mention. There's been witchcraft in Massachusetts since the founding of the colony. There have always been witchcraft accusations. There'd been about 100, I think it's 106 people who'd been accused of witchcraft before 1692. Very few people were convicted and almost none of them had hanged, although someone had a few years before Salem, which is important. But it's not so much the outbreak of witchcraft that year that's shocking. What's shocking is the prosecution of it. And that's where Stoughton comes in, because it is largely he who is driving the court, even toward the end of the year when other people have begun to express doubts and begun to suggest that perhaps the court isn't proceeding according to the best legal practices. Stoughton is absolutely adamant, and he finally, when the witchcraft court is shut down in the fall, he will storm off the court, furious to have he says we were on the verge of getting rid of these people, and he'll storm off the court, still convinced that he was on the side of the angels.
Marianne asked a question: were these kind of visions happening in other parts of the colonies in the world at the time, or is this a localized phenomenon?
It's largely a localized phenomenon. There is a bit of witchcraft in the other colonies. I'm afraid New England takes the crown in terms of the intensity of belief in witchcraft. It really is a biblical construct, and that took me a while when I was working on the book. It took me a while to realize that I had to explain what a 17th century New England villager meant when he or she talked about witchcraft. Because really this is a biblical construct. This isn't the Wizard of Oz. This isn't a Harry Potter kind of witch. This is really a witch that has walked out of the Bible, a fundamentalist belief. And that is really so much part and parcel of the Puritan texts and the parts of England from which the Massachusetts settlers come. And so they bring with them to New England, and this is a slight digression, but permit me because it's sort of interesting here. They bring with them to New England essentially the Anglo-Saxon witch, but with a few variations. And the few variations are added thanks to Cotton Mather, who at this moment is the great hope of the New England ministry. He's 29 years old. He's published a few books and will go on to publish countless others. And into a text which is familiar in Salem and all these villages in 1692, he inserts a story of Swedish witchcraft and of a Swedish witchcraft epidemic, which is shockingly similar in many ways to what will happen in Salem. And that epidemic will involve things that had never before taken place in the American colonies and anywhere in the American colonies, and certainly not in Massachusetts, including, for example, people flying. There hadn't really been flying before among American witches, and there hadn't been satanic pacts and Sabbaths, and that is very much an import from the continent. So that's a different kind of witchcraft, which gives us a certain number of clues as to what people may have been thinking or hearing about when they began to describe some of the more delusional goings on in 1692.
Regarding, you just mentioned Cotton Mather. You have Increase Mather, you have Cotton Mather, a lot of reference to them. But as a father and son, there's clearly at odds with each other over witchcraft. Their beliefs are not the same. Talk about that. And obviously, one of another minister, Samuel Parris, it's his writings that you reference. Is his daughter and niece are the primary accusers. Obviously, religion and the ministry was important here. Talk about them, but in Increase Mather, Samuel Parris, talk about them.
The ministry is hugely important in every possible way. From the very basic, I'm thinking about one of the 16-year-old girls, an Andover blacksmith's daughter, who at one point is accused of witchcraft, and she is escorted to her deposition with by her stepbrother on horseback, who's basically telling her the entire way as they make their way to her arraignment, who's basically saying to her, "You're a witch, you know you're a witch." And she gets there and her minister is there, and she's essentially seated between her minister and her stepbrother, and they're both saying to her, "You're a witch, we know you're a witch." And you can understand how, especially for a child, to be told this by a figure of authority would be pretty much convincing. And when you get to the question of why were there so many confessions, many of these confessions come because people have been in close quarters with or discussing things with their ministers who are able to convince them that, in fact, witchcraft is at work. Cotton Mather and Increase Mather are endlessly fascinating to me. Increase Mather, the father, who's in his 50s, is the president of Harvard at this point and is the senior most intellectual in New England. Cotton is, as I've said, his immensely brilliant and charismatic son. The two of them are all over this. This plays to everything that they've studied. That for their own reasons, and that's largely Cotton Mather, which I'll talk about in a second, they very much embrace this outbreak of witchcraft. Cotton Mather will weigh in several times in the course of these months, each time with a sort of ambivalent statement, a statement that will begin with, he's asked several times by the justices. And I should say, by the way, no one on the court is a trained lawyer because there was no such thing in New England at the time, but the justices will ask him to weigh in. And he will at each point deliver a statement that essentially begins with the idea that one should proceed in these cases with exquisite caution, and end by the end of his statement with, "And I feel that you should go ahead with vigorous prosecution." Each one of these statements comes with a nevertheless, essentially. So he's very much unclear, and he's very much kind of two minds about how this should go. But for his own reasons, he's very intent on this being prosecuted. And after the trials have ended, after Stoughton has stalked off the court, after the idea has been largely discredited, in a private communication, Cotton Mather will write that he essentially felt this was all for the good of New England, because it had filled the pews and it had awakened the youth of New England, and really nothing had been lost in the process, completely neglecting the lives that may have been, the innocent lives that may have been lost, in fact, in the course of the witchcraft. So for him, this is really a badge of honor. This is really a moment of great piety. And this is a moment for him to star because he is decoding all of this for much of New England. The father and son will come down on slightly different sides of the issue as the court is desperately asking toward the end of the summer for guidance. And each of them, although there's meant to be a ban on books in the colony at this point, each of them will publish a book. And the books, the father and son books, the Increase and Cotton Mather books, will come down on different sides. And essentially, they will try to pretend that they haven't really come down on different sides of the issue. And Cotton Mather will basically say, I've said that we shouldn't, one of them says, we shouldn't prosecute anyone who's innocent, and the other one says that we should only prosecute the guilty. Isn't that the same thing? So there's a real sort of splitting hairs difference between the two books. But Increase Mather is definitely more conservative about this, more skeptical about some of the court procedures. At one point, one of the two dogs that dies, for example, is killed because it was understood to be diabolically possessed. And Increase Mather will, in his book, argue that that dog could not have been in cahoots with the devil, because had it been so, it wouldn't have died when it was shot. So, there's an enormous amount of just detailed hair splitting here. But Cotton Mather is really the one who will encourage things, who will grease the wheels, who will, in his sort of ambivalent way, urge the court along. I didn't answer your question about Samuel Parris. I'm sorry, he's kind of the junior varsity player here. He's very much the He's someone who came to the ministry by default. He's a less practiced religious leader. He's not a deep intellectual, and he's really sunk back on his heels when this begins and never entirely recovers.
And yet it's also his slave, Tituba, who seems, the larger her stories, the more the town believes. So talk about her.
So when the girls start to, when there's a manifestation of what is assumed to be witchcraft, which is essentially quaking and foaming and falling into trances and emitting these terrific cries, it will be some time before Samuel Parris will pursue the idea that this is actually witchcraft. But once, of course, they have cemented the idea that the girls are indeed suffering from witchcraft, they need to find out who the witch is. And so names get named. And the first three people who are accused are the obvious people who would be accused under the circumstances. The first three people you would vote off the island of an itinerant beggar woman named Sarah Good, who's essentially a hindrance to everyone in the community, who terrifies children and tends to turn up in barns and then berate people for their hospitality. A very litigious woman named Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, who's one of the two slaves at the Parris parsonage. And it would be so lovely to know more about her. We know so little about her background. But what is clear from her testimony is that she's a champion storyteller, first of all, that she lives in some fear of Reverend Parris, and probably of, presumably of Mrs. Parris as well. She's clearly very deferential to them. And that she is very close to the girls. So we have a mystery there, which is why the girls would have named her. She's living in close quarters with them. She probably slept in the same room, if not the same bed. She's praying with the Parris family. She's taking her meals with the Parris family. And yet she's one of the first they will accuse. And when she comes into court, clearly great things are expected, because there are several court reporters who are already on hand, ready to take down her testimony. And she lets forth this magnificent Technicolor tale of spectral creatures and a black man who's given her orders to slice people's heads off, and who's told her not to mention any of this to the Reverend Parris, and with whom she has flown to Boston. And it's this really kaleidoscopic piece of testimony that really sort of detonates in the community. Until this point, she's the first person to confess, first of all. The first two women I mentioned do not confess to witchcraft. And Tituba will not only confess, but she will really deliver the goods. She will deliver up this unfathomably complicated and colorful tale. And as soon as she has done that, people in the community, including grown men, will begin to see spectral creatures. Two middle-aged men, the very night that she testifies, will see this strange creature by the side of the road as they head home that evening. And so really what she says just sinks into everyone's imaginations.
Question here. Maine was part of Massachusetts at this time. Did this attitude spill over into Maine?
It doesn't. But the main piece of this is that one of the interesting things about the witchcraft epidemic that year is that you end up with a conspiracy against the state. What starts as a number of disjointed accusations against people for witchcraft turns into a settled plot against the government. And at the head of that plot is a former Salem Village minister, said to be a former Salem Village minister, named George Burroughs, who's living in present-day Maine, and who, in fact, minutes before he is carted off to Salem to be imprisoned, has essentially protected his parishioners against a very savage Indian attack. But he's living out on what was then the frontier in southern Maine, having come to blows himself with the Salem Village congregants, who are now Samuel Parris's congregants. Some of the other players in Salem that year will also have survived encounters with the Indians or Indian attack. And there's a great deal, even in the course of the trials, there's an Indian attack on one of the communities. So that feeling of being on the frontier, under assault, politically at sea, because there's a this is a politically very unsettled moment, at the end of an extremely cold winter, all of these things obviously will combine rather explosively with the witchcraft accusations.
Is that a key component to all this? King Philip's War has just ended shortly before. Obviously, there's that fear of nature, the fear of the Native American, et cetera. Is that an underlying fear that feeds into all of this?
I think there are two fears, and I'm not sure we can qualify which is greater than the other. There's clearly an enormous amount of what we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome, of people who've lost family members, who've been on the frontier, who've seen really atrocious things. Many of these girls are not living with their families because they've lost family members to those kinds of attacks. So that's clearly a part of this. Everyone would have known someone who had lost his life in the war, if not lost family members. And then you have that, you have the political scene, which I think is an equal pressure on the community, in the sense that no one knows at this point who the new governor is going to be, if the Massachusetts charter is going to be revoked, what form of punishment, if any, is going to be delivered for the fact that the colonists have essentially deposed their previous governor and sent him sailing back to England. So you have this sense of just being really in free fall in some way. And the first one is easier to chart because you can see some of that imagery in some of the witchcraft testimony. You see some of the savagery, which we know to have been true of some of those attacks on the frontier, in what some of the girls will mention in court. The political scene is a little bit harder to get to.
A good segue into this question. Hello, I'm interested in your comment about a possible choreographed witch trial. Do you think some were orchestrating these trials to look good in the face of the court of England?
Yes to both. I think there was definitely a sense of broadcasting to London, certainly in Stoughton's mind, and perhaps in the minds of other members of the court. There is definitely a feeling of needing to prove that we can adjudicate our own problems, that we don't need any interfering authorities from abroad, that we are a mature community who know what we're doing, that we're not just a bunch of locals who have no idea of the literature and no idea how to run a court case. In terms of the choreography, there's just no way that you could pull off some of the courtroom antics that the girls managed to pull off without some sense of planning among them. There's a later case of witchcraft in Massachusetts in which two sisters essentially collude to accuse someone of witchcraft, and they have everything, including a ladder for the flying scenes. I mean, there's just no way you could have done this. There's no way you could have tied your own hands behind your back. There's no way you could have all fallen to the ground at the same time, as these girls will do in the courtroom, had you not conferred beforehand in some way. And the same will be true in terms of naming names. So many of the people who are named are not people the girls knew personally. And gossip having been an immensely powerful force in communities where there were no newspapers, people knew a lot about each other. They knew who had rips in their coats and who had wounds on their thighs, and they knew a great deal of personal information. But they didn't know these people by sight necessarily. So there had to have been some discussion among the girls, or at least among families.
Could you comment on John Alden Jr.'s story of being an accuser and an accused during the trial?
Alden is one of these people who, it's hard to say where the animus against him might have come in. He's one of a small cohort of people who are clearly accused because of being influential or wealthy. And another one of those would be Philip English, who's one of the richest men in Salem town. And in these cases, what's interesting when you look at the women is that many of the women had been accused of witchcraft before. Many of them had been related to people who'd been accused of witchcraft before, which witchcraft was understood to be matrilineal, so that sort of made sense. Many of the women are, and this was endlessly interesting to me, are often very particularly talented at something. They're either readers, or they're women who make particularly good cheese, or they drive a particularly good bargain, or they're very prosperous, or they've had all of their children have miraculously survived. They're women who seem to be gifted in some way. And that sense of animus against people who were in some way successful seems to have played a role with John Alden, certainly. Who comes to the court to clear his name and ends up accused. Alden is doing a lot of business with Indians on the frontier, and there's a suspicion that that is one of the reasons why he finds himself in trouble. That he's somewhat suspect for the fact that he is doing something that may or may not have been smiled upon by the rest of the community.
Speaking of making something, here's a question. How many of the accused witches were making whiskey in their homes and selling it, medicinal or recreational?
I don't know. I'm eager to hear more on this subject. There were people who had ointments in their homes, which were understood to be somehow related to witchcraft. There were people who made excellent cheese and who were therefore thought to be suspect. I'm just racking my brains here for whiskey. I don't think I remember any whiskey. There's a great deal of drinking in New England. I don't need to tell all of us know that. And there are a great number of apparitions that that maybe could be written down to the fact that there's a great deal of drinking in New England, but I don't know anything about the whiskey in the homes necessarily accounting for this.
Not accusing any of us of being drinkers out there. Just scratch that from this court record.
There's definitely a woman who's accused because she has dragged her husband out of an inn where he's trying to drink with his buddies, and that's a reason why she seems to be suspect.
In most of history, it seems like women and children's concerns tend to be ignored, written off as overreactions. When I was a juror a few years ago, one question during selection was whether we thought children could be reliable witnesses. Why did Salem seem to trust the accusers so easily?
Oh, what a marvelous question. And I should say that that's partly, is this from Lauren, is that right? That's partly what drew me to the book in the first place, drew me to the idea of writing about the trials in the first place. The previous book had been about Cleopatra. I'd been thinking a lot about women's voices and when we listen most intently to women. And when I started thinking about young women, I could only think of two moments in history where really an adolescent female dominates the narrative. And one is Joan of Arc, and the other was Salem in 1692. So to your question, I think a large part of it has to do with something that is lost to us, which is the utter, I don't even know how to put it, the utter nerve-scratching, head-scratching, cacophonous fear that hearing a bunch of girls in pain would have involved. In other words, you have these girls in court, and they're insisting that they are bewitched, and they are falling into trances, and they are screaming at the tops of their lungs, and they are extracting pins from their flesh, and they're showing teeth marks on their arms, and they're pretzeling into different postures and arching their backs. And I think to have looked away from that would have been next to impossible, especially in what we know to have been extremely small, dark, claustrophobic spaces, not only at home, but in the meeting houses where these depositions took place, which is the Salem Village Meeting House is basically 30 by 30. I mean, it's a tiny space. So to be that close up to these clearly tortured young women, I think would have been shocking and horrifying, and it would have been impossible to look away and to fail to believe that they were telling the truth, because something clearly did afflict them. And today we have other words for, today it's conversion disorder or whatever, what used to be known as hysteria, that we would say was causing that kind of distress. But to have witnessed it firsthand, I think would have been insanely moving, and also would have been very hard to look away and to ignore. I also think, to a great extent, what the girls were purveying played into a lot of people's narratives. And it certainly worked for some of the adults in the community. Ann Putnam, who's one of the accusers' father, had a great investment here in moving the trials along. Many members of the court and of the ministry, as we've discussed, had every investment in wanting to see these trials proceed. So everyone had his reasons. There were very many agendas that were on the table here, and the girls in many ways assisted in those agendas.
Two of the characters that jumped off the page to me, they were not, I don't know if you call them major characters, and yet I think they were so emblematic of what you were writing about, was John Hawthorne, the Salem magistrate, and Jonathan Corwin, because they both seem to be looking for guilt, that they were going to find guilt no matter what. And was that kind of an underlying current that you found going through this, that we're going to find guilty people if it slays us?
I don't think I felt there was a predisposition to guilt. I think it became very hard for some of the reasons we've talked about. I think it became very hard to turn away from the fact that there was clearly something amiss, and that once people began to confess, it was incontrovertible. Once people have confessed, once Tituba even has confessed to witchcraft, it's very hard to sort of upend the narrative. And what will happen at a certain point in the summer, once the witchcraft jumps really from Salem to Andover, the authorities, including the two you just mentioned, know what they're looking for. And when they're deposing people, when they're taking depositions from people, they begin to ask very leading questions. And the result of the very leading questions is a very cohesive narrative. So that by July, August, you start hearing the same stories from everybody. And that reinforces the sense that this really must have happened. So that by the middle of the summer, you don't just have these random acts of witchcraft of someone hurting someone's child. You have this satanic feast where the entire colony might be upended by this crew of diabolical agents who are being led by George Burroughs. And once that happens, I think it's everyone believes it's in his best interest to pursue this thing, because it seems as if everything is at stake. And that's when you have this kind of free-for-all where people are confessing because it seems the only way to save their own lives. And when you confess, you by definition stick into your confession an accusation of someone else. So it's like a grenade that you're launching. And that spreads, the contagion factor is immense. So you have a tremendous number of people suddenly attesting to the same narrative and pointing fingers at each other, very often people to whom they are related, and strangely often people in their own households.
You touched on something earlier, and Kirsten's got a question like what was going on in going into 1692, and you mentioned about the fear of losing their charter. There had been Indian wars. It's a really hot summer. This convergence of things. Was there kind of I don't know if there's a pecking order of what was the most fearful of the time, but is it just easy to say that in 1692, in a really hot summer, with a lot on the throes of Native American wars, and just you're worried about losing your governmental charter, it was the perfect storm that just allowed all this to happen? Is that oversimplistic, or is that a neat little summation of what was happening in the world in Salem, Massachusetts at that time?
I think it's more a neat summation than it is simplistic. I think it would be simplistic to say, oh, this was property taxes, or this was simply the threat of Indians on the frontier, or this was one single thing. This is clearly a whole concatenation of things working together, and obviously working differently in different communities and with different people. The fact that you do have a very cold winter, a household which is running out of firewood, a minister at odds with his community, two communities which are at odds with each other, Salem Village and Salem Town, a new administration that needs to prove itself, a ministry that is kind of holding off progress in some ways, and holding on to its autonomy and to its authority. I think all of those things clearly add up. What you do see happening in terms of the weather and just the sort of day-to-day life is is what happens when things begin to relent. When you begin to ask, how did these trials end, or how did this delusional thinking end? You begin to think about, well, it's the end of the summer of 1692, and any number of people have witnessed any number of hangings. But also it's time to sort of begin to harvest the fields and stock up the cellars for winter and pick the fruit. And no one really has time to sit around and listen to witchcraft testimony anymore. And I do think that plays one. I mean, there are a number of reasons, and we can talk about how this finally shudders to a halt. But I do feel like there the climactic pieces do come into play, and the sheer practicality of really one couldn't sit around and take down witchcraft testimony at a moment like that, or it was going to be a very hungry winter, comes into play.
How long did it take you to research this? And did you walk away with a favorite or least favorite character out of all of this? Who resonated with you, or who did you really despise?
It took me about 5 years. I think I started pretty much as I was finishing, just after I had finished Cleopatra. And I went up to read the papers, which were then in the Peabody Essex. And I should say that, one of the problems with writing about Salem is that we don't have the trial papers. What we have are, we have depositions, and we have the prison documents. We have all kinds of supporting pieces of paper. We don't actually have the trial papers. So we have a limited number of documents. And we also know relatively little about these people, about many of these people, except for what happened to them in 1692. Some of them we can find in the earlier, my favorite set of books in the entire world are the records of the quarterly courts of Essex County, which are all of the previous court cases. So you can see these people surfacing in court. You can see who's litigious and who's more and less litigious. And you can sometimes follow them after 1692, but in many cases, particularly the women, all we know about them is what we know from those very tumultuous months. What was the second half of your question, Mark? Was there anyone I loved? I tended to like a few of the accused. I think I was most fascinated by a few of the accused, particularly Burroughs, because he's the one person for whom we can't figure out exactly why he is accused. And there are any number of reasons which I go into the book, but it's really fairly ambiguous as to why he would have been so much disliked, not just by people in the community, which does make a certain amount of sense. He was clearly an abusive husband and a very difficult man, but why the ministry doesn't like him and why the ministry is so eager, both increasing Cotton Mather, clearly truly disliked Burroughs and held something against him. Cotton Mather in particular won't even name him when he comes to write about the trials. He'll refer to him only by his initials, as if by naming him, he would have given him more legitimacy or more power than Mather ever wanted to allow Burroughs. So George Burroughs was one, if only because I just couldn't completely solve that mystery. And some of the others I think were the more sharp-tongued among the accused. Some of the accused will immediately say, "You're right, I must be a witch." And some of them will really give the court a run for their money. And I'm thinking of Susanna Martin, for example, who is always challenged as to how she could have pulled off this or that act of magic. And one of the acts of supposed magic she pulls off is that she comes out in from the rain and she seems to be dry. And, she's asked, "How did you manage that?" And she basically says, "I didn't like to get wet." She's extremely unforthcoming, and she just has absolutely no time for this. And for the people who stood their ground against these kinds of pressures, one can't help but feeling an immense admiration. There's just, you can feel the fear in the air when you read through the court papers. You begin to see the kind of pressures that were put on people in prison. Many of the women talk about the other prisoners yelling at them and spitting at them and harassing them in prison to confess. You have ministers telling young girls that they must be witches. So for the people who resisted those kinds of pressures, and the people like John Proctor, who's one of the older men who's accused, who will actually petition the court and say, this isn't happening properly. We really need a fair trial. One can only have admiration.
Were there any reluctant judges on the court who might have encouraged a slow down and stop to the trials? If so, could you please comment on that person or those people?
It would be nice to think there were, Cynthia, wouldn't it? The court really moves in lockstep. A part of that, and this goes back to what I had said earlier about the fact that we're talking about a very homogeneous community here. Consensus is enormously important, both religiously speaking and from an administrative point of view. No one really steps out of line on the court. One of the justices late in the day will ask Cotton Mather his opinion, but he doesn't do so personally. He really does so on behalf of all of the justices. And only afterwards will Samuel Sewell, who one of the great members of the court, will years later essentially atone for his sins. Will stand up in meeting and ask and say that he is sorry for what happened that year. It's really interesting to see what happens afterward, because there is a sense that there has been a colossal wipeout. There's a sense of tremendous grief and shame and guilt. And what for the most part happens is that everyone goes quiet. And I've never researched anything where there's such a tremendous, almost collusion little sense of quiet around an event. The books of sermons are excised. The Salem Village ministry book is excised. Correspondences don't have those, or fail to have those months. Local ministers will skip from 1691 to 1693. All kinds of things go missing. And Sewell is one of the few people who will look back, who will actually face it years later and look back on it and say, and offer his apologies. One of the other people who will do that will be Ann Putnam Jr., the girl who will accuse almost everyone who hangs, everyone except for two people who hang. And she essentially says, she basically says, the devil made me do it. She basically says she was an instrument in someone else's scheme. And she reminds the meeting that she didn't act alone. And she asks for the families around her she asks for the apologies. She apologizes to the families around her whom she hopes will forgive her. But essentially she writes this down to, this infernal figure who's off in the wings.
Are there genealogical records that document the cause of death for the people who were hanged?
Oh, wow, Marianne, that's a great question. No, there aren't, to the best of my knowledge. And what's also interesting about the silence is that we know relatively little about the hangings. We have accounts of the hangings in Cotton Mather. We have accounts of the hangings in some of the on some of the court papers. We don't know where we don't know where the hangings took place, which is part of this conspiracy of silence. We don't know where the bodies were buried. There are hints that families were allowed afterward to go back and claim their loved ones and bury them properly, but we don't know any of that for certain. So there's really, again, something of a mystery around what happened after the accused witches hanged. I should also say that the belief in witchcraft survives the trials, and the sense that even the people who are in prison accused, who think that they themselves are innocent, believe other people were witches, believe other people are guilty. So many people do believe that the people who have hanged, who've been hung, are guilty of witchcraft. And there would have been something of an aversion to going anywhere near those bodies.
You started at the top of the hour by referencing Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which, as you said, we've all read. Some of us have played it in high school, that kind of thing. For the foreseeable future, we all understand the phrase witch trial. We understand it, McCarthyism, all this kind of thing that went on through our history. Will this always be a touch point in American history? Is this always going to be something that we reference, look back on, analyze? Because we started at that, Population of New England could have fit in the Yankee Stadium. It was a total of 19 people and 2 dogs, and yet it's just so it's got such a hold on all of us. That is this always going to be ever thus?
Well, given the amount of time we've spent over the last few years discussing witch hunts, I think the answer is yes. You know, Yankee Stadium, it would have been at the time, but the number of us who exponentially, the number of Americans who descend from people living in New England at the time is immense. So many of us, an extraordinary number of us, obviously are connected in some way to these years. But it is also, I think, hardwired into our history. I mean, I think it's a kind of guardrail. It's a kind of, you know, it's something that keeps us in line when we start to veer too far off the highway. And I think that there's a sense here that we need, you know, you see a blinking red light and you begin to think, you know, this is delusional thinking. This is, you know, a kind of intellectual lockstep that is dangerous and can lead one, you know, really off the cliff. That kind of, there's a paranoid sense here, which, you know, Richard Hofstadter has wrote about so brilliantly, which is really there from the beginning, that sense of blood violence within which American history begins, and that sense of having a, you know, a foreign invader of some kind, having someone whom we can blame for so much of what's gone amiss, I think is very central to our history.
Are you working on something new right now?
I'm working on a book about Samuel Adams. So I'm working on, I'm in the 18th century and running up to the American Revolution. But what's interesting, just because you mentioned it, are the parallels which are often drawn by the Crown officers in Massachusetts at the time with the crazy delusional thinking that's going on, delusional in their minds, in the late 1760s, and the witch trials. They keep saying, you know, things haven't been this crazy. It's like the witch trials all over again. These people are so out of hand. So I think that's the answer to your question about how hardwired it is.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time tonight. This has been great. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and have you take questions. So thank you so very much for doing this. Good luck on the Samuel Adams project. I don't think you'll need luck. I think it's going to be great. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. And thank you all for the wonderful questions.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Thanks.
Yeah.